Hey guys, so this is my second attempt at recording this video. I understand that I had some feedback problems on the first one. I think I was wearing my mic incorrectly. Excuse me. All right, so let's talk about realism and the transition from the literary period Romanticism to realism. So generally when we talk about literary periods, we start with what happened in history and people's lives to instigate that change. Usually it is something on a large scale, and it is something tragic or disturbing, because often it takes that kind of event for people to look at their worldview, to think about how they've been living their lives and decide that they need to make a change. Sometimes it's very disorienting to have this belief system and then see something happen and realize that your belief system no longer holds true, that it isn't working for you. And we talked about in Romanticism that idea that they believed in regenerated man and regenerated earth, and that humans could bring about that regeneration. So what we see with the shift from Romanticism to realism is a war that happens in front of people instead of on the distant shores of France and America. It's happening right in front of them, and it is the Civil War that kind of sparks this change, at least for Americans. So I want to show you a picture. The one I showed you of for Romanticism showed these peasants climbing a tower in order to fly the French flag. What you see here is very different. There's nothing romantic or dramatic or even necessarily noble about what you see here. You see three women engaging in their daily labor, what they would do every day just in order to survive, provide for themselves, provide for their families. It's not showing you anything that you would not see on a regular basis. And that, of course, is kind of the basis of realism, that what you see in art, what you see in literature or poetry would be something not out of the norm. It would reflect your everyday life. So let's go back a little bit. What do we know about Romanticism? One, that it was largely optimistic, that it began with the French Revolution, and I gave you that buzzword of optimism. For the dark romantics, they were a little bit more, or I guess I should say a little bit less optimistic about what humans could accomplish, because they saw the fallibility of man. All right, now this word realism suggests exactly what it sounds like, that they're going to, artists here are going to give you a realistic picture of the world. So in 1860 to 1890, think about what's happening in America at this time. Now, if we were in class together, I'd kind of be drawing this out of you having a discussion about it. But what we see is the beginning of the Civil War up through Reconstruction. And that is largely the inspiration for this literary period. Like I said, instead of acknowledging that there's a war being fought for this noble, honorable reason in France, we see a very ugly war taking place right in front of us. And it's not us fighting some sort of outside insidious influence like the Revolutionary War was. It's us fighting ourselves over something very dark and ugly, over capitalism and slavery. And obviously there's a connection there. Slavery was instituted because it allowed people to make a lot of money much more easily. In order to do that, of course, you had to convince yourself, you had to convince your other people and the people who were being enslaved that they were somehow less than you were. To end that, there was a civil war here, as you know, and instead of getting oil paintings, people were seeing images like this, sometimes in newspapers. they aren't getting these romanticized, dramatized paintings. They were seeing actual photographs, real people who had died, suffered, sacrificed in this war. And that makes it very difficult for people to look at the facts of war, that you are killing people, and be okay with it. So it's a much uglier picture of war than they would have seen with the French Revolution. All right, so I kind of just went through this, the French Revolution versus the American Civil War. The differences are the location, how it's depicted, and one provokes romanticism because they're fighting for everybody's freedom, and one ushers in realism because they're having to admit that this country that was founded on this idea of freedom actually existed largely as it did as a world power because of slavery, which flies in the face of freedom. All right, so realism is, and this is talking about as a literary technique, is the faithful representation of reality. So let's talk about this word, verisimilitude. If you were in a school that did Latin and Greek roots, then you might recognize that veri, that very, as meaning truth. So verisimilitude means that even though something is fiction, it's simulating the truth. And we do that in two ways. One, a technique, which is realistic description. In romantic works, you often saw characters depicted as being wholly good or wholly bad. The women were always very beautiful and very saintly if they were the heroine. If you read The Scarlet Letter, you may remember that Hester Prynne is depicted as being just the most beautiful woman that existed in Salem, maybe that existed everywhere. It's just not a realistic depiction of an actual human being. She was depicted very much like Snow White, fair skin, black hair, beautiful eyes, things of that nature. So when we move to realism, you're no longer getting these descriptions of people or places as being very dramatic. It's trying to depict real life. So if they describe a person, it's going to be your average everyday person. In fact, in realism, you often don't get a description of a person. It's not as important for showing their character as it was in romanticism. And later when we talk about characterization, that'll make a little more sense. All right, so technique, realistic description, and also the subject matter. You're trying to, or realist authors, excuse me, realist authors are trying to depict situations you would actually see. So if we go back to look at some of the romantic works, sorry guys, my allergies are stuck all in my throat and chest right now. So if we think back to some romantic works such as The Count of Monte Cristo, you're seeing a man who was falsely accused of murder, sent to prison for 10 years. While he's in prison, the man in the cell next to him kind of takes him under his wing. He teaches him to read and to write and to fight, and he gives him a treasure map. So this guy breaks out of prison, takes that treasure map, finds the treasure, becomes one of the richest men in the world, and uses that money and that newfound power to get revenge on all the people who helped send him to prison. It's a very dramatic story. It's good, it's fun to watch, but it is not in any way realistic. What you'll see in realism is things that are not out of the ordinary, things that could happen any day. And you see that with the story of An Hour. A woman losing her husband, a woman having a heart problem, a woman dying because of that heart problem. All of those are conceivable. All of those things that are things that would and could actually happen. So much less drama, I would say. All right, so let's look at this quote. Again, for every literary period, I'm trying to give you some art, visual art to depict, and then sort of a quote that will help kind of summarize and encapsulate. This one refers to the Romantic period, but it also talks a little bit about the literary period that's upcoming, Naturalism, and kind of situates realism between two of those. So according to William Harmon and Hugh Holman, where romanticists transcend the immediate to find the ideal, and naturalists plumb the actual or superficial to find the scientific laws that control its actions, realists center their attention to a remarkable degree on the immediate, the here and now, the specific action, and the verifiable consequence. So it's dealing with the present, whereas romanticists can get caught up in what happened in the past and how that's impacting their present and their future. Realists are saying in the story, this happens, and because this happens, this and this and this happen. Here are the consequences of that action, of that decision, or of just what the world threw at this person at that point in time. So it's much more situated in the present. Okay, so let's look at plotting characters. So character here is more important than action and plot. So again, you're not necessarily going to get action-packed stories. And if you think of the story of an hour, it's very short, only takes place in an hour, so that's the focus on the present. And it is a lot of thinking. You have a major event at the beginning and a major event at the end. All right, humans control their destinies, so characters act on their environment rather than simply reacting to it. And the Count of Monte Cristo, you have a man reacting to the situation that he's been thrown into prison. And in realism, you're going to get characters deciding that they don't like the situation that they're in, and so they do something to change it. And I think maybe one of the best examples of that is going to be the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So Huck, at the beginning of his story, has he's found a treasure too, and he has money. He's staying with the widow Douglas in a comfortable situation. And he decides he's just not happy there, so he leaves and he goes back home. His father is at home, and his father is an abusive drunk. And Huck stays there for a while and realizes this isn't where I want to be either. So instead of staying there, suffering, or going back to the widow Douglas, he runs away and decides he's just going to live on the river. So you see these characters make a decision for themselves rather than society controlling them or letting their families make decisions for them. Now here, because that doesn't quite jive with what we see in the story of an hour, it's important for me to say that not all of these characteristics will apply to each and every story. Remember, these are people looking back 50, 100, 150 years later and saying, okay, so out of the hundreds of works written during this time period, here are kind of the commonalities. So this one doesn't work quite as well with the story of an hour as it does with some other pieces. All right, next, events will be plausible. We've already gone over that. Class is important. Now, we talked about romanticism being aimed toward the middle class. And that's even more so the case here. We do have kind of an established middle class at this point in the States. And these books, these short stories, the poetry is going to be written toward the largest segment of the population, that is the middle class at this point. So even though we saw Young Goodman Brown as being written for the middle class, you see an even more dramatic step down in how formalized the language is. And on that note, diction is more natural. It's not heightened. It's not poetic. People are talking the way they would actually talk. The tone can often be comical, satiric, matter of fact. And I think, again, Mark Twain is a really good example of how that plays out. You do see a very matter of fact tone in the story of an hour. She's just telling you, here's what happened. The use of symbolism is controlled and limited. Hawthorne and other romantics loved their symbolism. And you see a lot less of that in realist works. What you do see more of is a use of imagery. And that happens both in the story of an hour and novels like Huck Finn. All right, next one, objectivity becomes very important. And I'm not sure if this happened because many of the authors who are writing realist works started out as journalists, or um, if it was the other way around. So you have Mark Twain, who is a journalist, Kate Chopin, who wrote this story, was a journalist, Jack London, John Steinbeck. All of these people wrote nonfiction for newspapers or editorials, things like that. So being objective as a news source was important. And they carried that over into their short stories and their novels and their poetry, and that they're not telling you what they want you to feel about a character. They're laying out the facts and they're letting you decide how you feel about the character. Whereas in Hawthorne's works, he pretty much told you what he wanted you to see and believe and understand about his characters. All right, so let's look at some familiar authors and titles. Again, this is just to kind of situate you within the time period. So hopefully you've read at least one of these and now you can recognize some of these characteristics. And I'll talk a little bit about the first one after I go through all of them. So Ambrose Bierce wrote a short story, Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Kate Chopin, who wrote The Story of an Hour, also wrote this novel, The Awakening. Mark Twain, any of his works would qualify. Now, Jack London and John Steinbeck kind of straddle these two literary periods of realism and naturalism. So you could classify them as either one of these. So you'll see their names again when we talk about naturalism. Okay, so just a little bit about Ambrose Bierce and Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. I think that this is a story that kind of perfectly encapsulates this transition from romantic thought to realist thought. So I'll summarize the story very quickly and explain what I mean. This is a story set during the Civil War, and the main character is a Confederate soldier who got caught by Union soldiers attempting to blow up a bridge to disrupt supply lines and things of that nature. So this wasn't a time period when you would catch somebody and you would try them for treason. It was a decision that they would make on the spot, right? So they catch him and they're immediately going to hang him for treason, and they're going to do so on this bridge that the main character was going to blow up. So they get him all set up. They drop him, and as he drops on the rope snaps. The main character falls into the water below. Union soldiers are shooting at him. He swims away, gets to the shore safely, and is running as Union soldiers are chasing him. So he's running through the woods. He eventually gets home. He's running up to his house. The front door opens and his wife comes out, and they're about to have this lovely reunion. He is safe after all. He's gone home to his wife. And just before he and his wife embrace, you realize that he has actually been hanged. And that story that you just read about him escaping happens in his mind in that split second before the rope does catch him and kills him. So he does die at the end of this story. And this is realist writers saying, this is not the Count of Monte Cristo. This is not the Three Musketeers. There's no one coming to save this guy. This guy made a decision, and the consequence was that he was hanged for treason. So it's kind of a dramatic shift in that way, especially if you were very used to romantic writing, if that's what you've been reading all your life, and then you get this realist work, it's kind of a shock. And realists were saying, we're not buying into those dramatic, unlikely stories anymore. This is real life, and this is what we're going to show you. All right, so I am going to pause the lecture here, and we will go to the second lecture in which we will talk about the literary term.